I am Joshua, 28 years old, and my own parents threw me out into the street like garbage because my older brother blamed me for his divorce. Before I tell you about the single, devastating email that brought my toxic, image-obsessed family to their knees begging for my forgiveness, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The rain was coming down in thick, freezing sheets that night. It soaked right through my thin denim jacket before I even made it to the edge of the paved driveway. My boots slipped on the wet asphalt, but I refused to stop and catch my balance. I just kept walking forward, my jaw clamped shut so tightly my teeth ached. Behind me, the heavy oak front door of my childhood home stood wide open. It spilled a long rectangle of warm, yellow light onto the manicured front lawn. Scattered across that perfectly cut grass, sitting in the mud and the freezing rain, were all my worldly possessions. My older brother, Julian, stood under the dry protection of the porch awning. He was holding his face in both of his hands, his broad shoulders shaking violently with exaggerated, theatrical sobs. If you were a neighbor walking your dog past our house right then, you would think his entire universe had just collapsed into dust. He had just spent the last 2 hours sitting in our parents' living room, drinking my father's expensive bourbon, and convincing them that his impending, highly public divorce was entirely, 100% my fault. According to Julian's brilliant narrative, I was the one who introduced him to another woman. I was the degenerate younger brother who covered for his late-night absences. I was the one who constantly encouraged him to throw his vows away and live a little. None of it was true. Not a single syllable. My mother stood right next to him on the porch. Her hand was rubbing his back in slow, soothing circles, treating him like a wounded child instead of a 34-year-old corporate executive. She did not look at me, not once. She didn't march down the steps, grab my shoulders, and demand to hear my side of the story. She didn't ask Julian for a single text message, a single photo, or a single shred of actual proof. Julian was the golden child. He was the senior vice president. He was the son with the 6-figure salary, the sprawling suburban house in a gated community, and the perfect magazine-ready wife. If Julian pointed his finger at me and said I ruined his life, then my parents treated it as absolute gospel. My father was the one who actually threw my things outside. I can still vividly see the thick blue veins bulging in his neck as he screamed at me. He didn't just ask me to pack my bags and leave in the morning. He marched into my bedroom, physically grabbed my canvas duffel bag, and hurled it out the front door into the storm. My heavy leather laptop bag hit the wet grass with a sickening, heavy thud. A glass picture frame, the only existing photograph of me and my late grandfather fishing at the lake, slipped from his grip and shattered violently against the concrete walkway. The glass splintered into 100 tiny, glittering pieces in the rain. "Get out!" my dad shouted. His voice was rough, dripping with a kind of visceral disgust that made my stomach turn. "You're not worthy of this family. I don't ever want to see your face in this house again. You are a disgrace to this family name." I stood there in the pouring rain for a long moment. The freezing water ran down my forehead, mixing with the hot, angry tears stinging the corners of my eyes. I looked past my father and locked eyes with Julian. For a fraction of a second, Julian dropped his hands away from his face. The porch light caught his eyes. There were no tears there, none at all. There was only a cold, calculated, razor-sharp relief. He wasn't grieving a broken marriage. He was relieved that his scapegoat was taking the bullet. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was proud of his performance. Truth starts to feel incredibly small and fragile when your own mother refuses to even look at your face, and your father is actively kicking your suitcase off the porch with the toe of his boot. I realized right then, standing in the mud, that fighting back would be entirely useless. In a house built on appearances, the loudest, most dramatic lie always gets believed first. So I didn't scream back. I didn't fall to my knees and beg them to listen to reason. I didn't try to defend my character. I walked over to the soggy grass, picked up my soaked bags, hauled them over my shoulder, and walked away into the dark street. Exactly 1 week later, I was sitting entirely alone in a cramped, drafty, rented warehouse space on the industrial east side of Savannah. The rain was drumming a relentless, metallic rhythm against the thin tin roof, a sound I was slowly forcing myself to get used to. I sat in a cheap folding chair with a paperback book open on my lap, trying desperately to teach my nervous system what quiet felt like again. I was exhausted down to my marrow. My bones literally ached from sleeping on a deflating air mattress for 7 nights straight, and my mind was a torturous, never-ending loop of my father's screaming face and my mother's turned back. Then, the laptop sitting on the wobbly desk next to me chimed. A single new email had arrived in my inbox. The sender's name made me sit up so fast I nearly knocked my coffee mug onto the floor. The subject line made my stomach completely drop out of my body. I opened the message. I read the short, overly polite corporate text once. Then I read it again, my eyes scanning every single word to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. My hands started to shake. It wasn't from fear, and it wasn't from the cold draft in the room. It was from a sudden, overwhelming electric rush of adrenaline. By the time I clicked on the attached PDF document and scrolled through the heavily detailed pages, I understood exactly why my golden child brother had been so incredibly desperate to blame me first. Within 20 short minutes of me forwarding that exact document to my family, my cell phone exploded. The device vibrated so violently against the cheap folding table that it nearly rattled right off the edge. The screen lit up, blindingly bright in the dim warehouse, with notification after notification stacking up in real time. First came the desperate text message from Julian. "Joshua, please, I am begging you, do not send that email to anyone else. We can fix this. Please, just pick up the phone." 2 minutes later, a frantic message from my mother lit up the screen. "Joshua, honey, we were so wrong. We made a terrible, terrible mistake. Please, baby, give us one chance to explain ourselves. We love you." Then my father's number flashed. "We need to talk. Come home immediately. Let's handle this like men." I sat in the harsh yellow light of my cheap desk lamp and just stared at the glowing glass screen. I thought about the shattered picture frame lying in the wet grass. I thought about the way my mother rubbed Julian's back while he destroyed my reputation. I thought about Julian's fake, dry tears. The entire power dynamic in my family had just violently, permanently shifted, and they were absolutely terrified. They weren't sorry. They were cornered. I picked up the phone, feeling the cool metal in my palm. I typed 2 simple words, hit send, and tossed the phone back onto the table. "No, never." But before I show you exactly what was printed inside that devastating email, and before I explain why it turned my arrogant, self-righteous family into a panicked, groveling mess in under an hour, I need to take you back. I need to tell you exactly how I found that document. I need to tell you the meticulous, calculated reason why the golden child chose his own younger brother as his sacrificial lamb. The place I moved into wasn't a real, functional apartment. It was a converted brick warehouse space tucked behind an old auto body shop. It had terrifyingly narrow stairs, a crooked kitchen drawer that always stuck halfway, and exactly one small, dirty window above the sink that looked directly out onto a solid brick wall. The air always smelled faintly of sawdust, old motor oil, and damp concrete. But it was mine. I paid the rent with my own money. There was a strange, deep, almost medicinal comfort in sitting in a room where nobody could suddenly change their mind and decide I didn't belong there anymore. I worked as a collections manager at a local maritime museum down by the river. My salary was modest, barely enough to cover my basic living expenses and the rent for the warehouse, but I loved the work. Most of my days were spent in absolute silence, preserving old, brittle navigation maps, cataloging rusted brass instruments from sunken ships, and carefully handling fragile objects that had survived horrific storms, saltwater corrosion, and the brutal passage of time. I used to think the quiet, meticulous nature of my job made me a naturally calm person. After the horrific nightmare with my family, I realized the truth. It didn't make me calm. It just made me exceptionally good at handling deeply damaged things. In the long, agonizing days immediately following my eviction, the silence of the warehouse was totally deafening. I spent hours lying flat on my back on the air mattress, staring up at the water stains on the ceiling, playing that rainy night over and over in my head like a broken movie projector. When you are isolated, a very dangerous, toxic thought starts creeping into your brain. What if I actually did do something wrong? What if I had casually introduced Julian to some woman at one of our museum charity galas months ago, and I completely forgot about it? What if I made a joke, or covered for a phone call, and inadvertently lit the match that burned his marriage down? When your entire family turns against you with such absolute, unwavering certainty, it gaslights you. It forces you to question your own sanity and your own memory. I was drowning in a sea of self-doubt, genuinely wondering if I possessed some dark, destructive flaw that I couldn't even see. Julian, meanwhile, lived in a completely different universe. He and his wife, Sarah, were the picture of suburban royalty. They chaired local charity events together. They smiled with perfect, bleached teeth for local lifestyle magazines. Julian was a master of his own public relations. To outsiders, their marriage looked like the absolute pinnacle of the American dream. But to those who actually knew Julian, knew his temper, his ego, his constant need for validation, his life looked heavily, exhaustingly managed. Everything he did was a calculated performance, a stage play designed to make him look flawless. And lying there in my cold warehouse, I was starting to believe his script. I was starting to believe I had accidentally walked onto his stage and ruined the show. 3 days after I got kicked out of the house, a loud, aggressive pounding echoed on my heavy metal door. I opened it to find my best friend, Carter, standing in the hallway. Carter was a heavy machinery mechanic, a guy who spent his days covered in grease, dealing exclusively with hard facts, stripped gears, and broken engines. He possessed zero patience for high society drama or emotional manipulation. He didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed past me, carrying 2 greasy cardboard boxes of pepperoni pizza, a sweating 6-pack of cheap beer, and enough radiating anger on my behalf to heat the entire drafty room. He kicked a stray moving box out of his way, handed me an ice-cold bottle, and sat directly on the concrete floor, crossing his legs. I sat down across from him and just poured everything out. I told him about the wild accusations. I told him about my father's screaming face, the bags thrown in the yard, the way my mother never once asked for my side of the story. I told him how my own brain was starting to betray me, how I was actually starting to doubt my own memory of the last 6 months. Carter took a massive bite of pizza, chewed it slowly, swallowed, and looked at me dead in the eye. His expression was harder than concrete. "Stop it," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "Listen to yourself right now, Josh. You are letting them inside your head. That story Julian told your parents? It is way too clean. It's too perfectly structured. A guy doesn't just invent a detailed, multi-layered lie like that while he's fake crying on the front porch. He didn't panic and make it up on the spot. He built that lie, brick by brick, long before he ever needed to use it." I shook my head, rubbing my tired eyes. "But why me, Carter? Why not just blame the marriage falling apart on normal things? Stress? Work? Why drag my name through the mud? Because people like your brother don't just want to avoid blame. They need a designated villain so they can play the tragic victim," Carter snapped, gesturing with his beer bottle. "They make you question your own memory while they gently guide everyone else toward the version of the story that protects their reputation. You're sitting here thinking about this like a younger brother whose feelings are hurt. You need to stop." He leaned forward, his eyes locked onto mine. "Stop thinking emotionally. Start thinking historically. You work in a museum. You track timelines. What happened before the lie?" Carter's words hit me like a splash of freezing water to the face. The fog of self-pity instantly evaporated. He was entirely right. Julian was a master planner. He never, ever did anything without a 10-step strategy. If he was throwing me under the bus for his divorce, it meant he was hiding something massive, something catastrophic, and he needed everyone looking directly at me so they wouldn't look at his own closet. I needed to stop acting like a wounded victim and start acting like the historian I was trained to be. The very next evening, Carter dragged me out of my warehouse and drove us to a high-end, dimly lit whiskey bar downtown. He had made a few discreet calls during his lunch break and found out that Wyatt was going to be drinking there. Wyatt was a junior executive at Julian's logistics firm. He wore tailored suits that were slightly too tight, drank expensive bourbon he couldn't afford, and was a notorious, relentless gossip who loved being the center of attention. If anyone knew about the hidden cracks in Julian's perfect corporate facade, it was Wyatt. We spotted him sitting alone at the bar and cornered him, guiding him into a deep leather booth near the back, far away from the music. Wyatt looked visibly nervous the second he saw my face. He immediately started stammering, trying to offer his fake condolences about my family situation, feeding me polished corporate nonsense about how divorces are always messy and families are complicated beasts. I slammed my hand flat on the wooden table, cutting him off completely. Wyatt, cut the crap. Why was Julian so ready and prepared to use my name? Wyatt swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He stirred the large ice cube in his glass, his eyes darting around the bar to make sure none of his colleagues were watching. He leaned in across the table and lowered his voice to a harsh whisper. Because he was already terrified of something else catching up to him, Wyatt said. My pulse jumped in my throat. What's something else? Wyatt hesitated, taking a long sip of his drink. There have been rumors circulating about Julian and a woman named Elena for months. She's an external consultant who audits the firm. Nothing is public. No photos, no big scenes. Just whispers by the coffee machine. But it got loud enough that Julian started acting wildly paranoid. He was checking his phone constantly. It was almost like he needed to create a massive, dramatic distraction within his own family before anyone at the office or his wife looked too closely at his own schedule. It was a solid, tangible lead. A name. Elena. But as Wyatt quickly stood up to leave, claiming he had an early morning strategy meeting, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The large decorative mirror mounted behind the bar perfectly reflected the glowing screen of his smartphone as he walked toward the exit. His thumbs were flying across the keyboard. I couldn't read the exact text, but I clearly saw the contact name pinned at the very top of his messaging app. Julian. My stomach twisted into a painful knot. Wyatt wasn't helping me out of the goodness of his heart. He was playing both sides of the fence. He was feeding me tiny scraps of office gossip while simultaneously acting as a spy, warning Julian in real time that I was out in the city asking dangerous questions. I realized right then, sitting in that leather booth, that I was entirely, fundamentally on my own. I couldn't trust a single person in Julian's wealthy, well-connected circle. I needed hard, undeniable facts, not slippery barroom gossip from cowards like Wyatt. I needed paperwork. The next morning, I bypassed the executives and tracked down Matthew. Matthew was the senior logistics director for the regional corporate events Julian's firm hosted. Matthew was a seasoned, no-nonsense guy in his 50s who operated strictly by the book. I knew from past conversations that he absolutely despised Julian's arrogant management style and his habit of bending company rules. I waited for Matthew in the sprawling concrete parking lot behind his office building, catching him just as he was walking to his car after his shift. I didn't waste his time with small talk or pleasantries. I looked him in the eye and told him I needed to know if Julian's travel schedules matched his actual corporate events over the last 6 months. Matthew stopped walking. He looked at me for a long, heavy minute, assessing the desperation in my face. Then, without saying a word, he set his heavy leather briefcase on the hood of his sedan, popped the brass latches, and pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of printed paper. "I'm not handing you this for revenge, Joshua," Matthew said, his voice quiet but incredibly firm. "I don't care about your family drama. I'm doing this because your brother crossed a professional line, and I am sick and tired of covering up his administrative messes to protect the firm's reputation." I took the paper from his hand. It was an internal logistics and rooming sheet from a massive, weekend-long corporate retreat held in Charleston 3 months prior. Most of the document was standard corporate filler: arrival times, dietary restrictions, caterer contacts. But handwritten in blue ink in the tight margins, right next to Julian's name, was a highly specific administrative note. Julian had been manually reassigned from the main executive block of rooms to a discreet, isolated suite in the far east wing of the resort. And right next to his room, booked on the exact same floor, was a room assigned to a consultant named Elena Vance. "Quiet reassignment," Matthew said, pointing a thick finger at the blue ink. No spouses were copied on these itinerary updates. The firm paid for the main block, but he paid for that specific suite upgrade out of his own pocket. "Numbers don't lie, Joshua. But I have to warn you, this isn't enough to sink a guy like Julian. He's slippery. He can easily explain this away to your parents as a coincidence, or a booking error by a junior assistant. You need something from inside his actual marriage to prove he was actively, intentionally covering his tracks." I thanked Matthew, shaking his hand firmly, and folded the paper carefully into the inside pocket of my jacket. As I drove away from the parking lot, the burning anger in my chest was crystallizing into something entirely different. It was becoming cold, sharp, and highly focused. Julian hadn't just made a drunken mistake. He had executed a deeply calculated, ongoing affair. And when the walls started closing in on him, he deliberately threw me under a moving bus to save his own luxurious life. I knew my next step was the most dangerous one. I had to speak to Sarah, Julian's wife, or rather, his soon-to-be ex-wife. I fully expected her to ignore my phone call, or maybe even curse me out and hang up. After all, her husband had just convinced her that I was the architect of her misery. Instead, when I texted her asking for 10 minutes of her time, she agreed to meet me at a quiet, independent coffee shop on the far edge of town that same afternoon. When Sarah walked through the glass door of the cafe, she looked absolutely exhausted. The polished, magazine-ready smile she always wore to family dinners was completely gone, replaced by deep, dark circles under her eyes and a pale complexion. She ordered a black tea and sat across from me, keeping her coat on. "Julian told our parents that I introduced him to some woman at a museum gala," I said, deciding to get straight to the painful point. "He told them I encouraged him to break his emotional boundaries and throw his marriage away." Sarah stared at her tea, then let out a bitter, hollow laugh that held zero humor. "No, that's a lie. I spoke to my divorce lawyer this morning, Joshua. We are pulling the bank records. Julian has been bleeding money like crazy for the last 6 months. Massive, unexplained cash withdrawals. Expensive weekend trips he claimed were mandatory for work, but his firm's HR department had absolutely no record of." "Then why did he blame me?" I asked, leaning forward, my voice tight. "Why drag my name into it?" "Because I found a hotel receipt," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "It synced to our shared home iPad by accident a few weeks ago. He must have logged into his email on the tablet and forgot to log out. He deleted the notification within seconds, but I was holding the iPad. I saw the name. It wasn't a corporate chain hotel he uses for business trips. It was a romantic boutique place. When I confronted him about it that night, he panicked. He went completely pale. A week later, he suddenly came up with this elaborate story about how you were a terrible influence, how you were trying to sabotage him, and how he was seeking therapy because of your toxic behavior." My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ground together. "What was the exact name of the hotel, Sarah? I need to know." She looked out the rain-streaked window, her eyes vacant. "The Ashcraft House." The moment she said those 3 words, all the air violently left my lungs. The Ashcraft House was a historic, luxury boutique property located about an hour outside the city limits. But that wasn't why I knew the name. I knew it because my Maritime Museum had hosted a massive, high-profile donor fundraising dinner there late last year, and I had been the staff member assigned to coordinate the reservation contact lists with their management. I didn't even finish my coffee. I practically sprinted to my car and drove recklessly back to the Maritime Museum. I ignored my coworkers, bypassed my desk, locked the heavy wooden door to the basement archives behind me, and booted up my secure work computer. My hands were visibly shaking as I dug furiously through the nested digital folders from the previous fiscal year. I finally pulled up the museum's master event profile associated with the Ashcraft House. During the agonizing, months-long planning phase for that donor dinner, I had manually attached my direct museum email address as a secondary administrative contact on the hotel's master booking system. It was standard protocol, a way to catch any automated billing errors or room assignment glitches before the donors arrived. My brain was working at lightning speed. If Julian had booked his secret romantic weekend getaway with Elena at that specific boutique hotel, and if he had lazily asked the front desk to look up his old corporate profile from our museum event to secure a corporate discount rate, there was a massive, glaring vulnerability. There was a very real chance my work email address was still buried deep in the back end of his guest profile as a secondary notification contact. It was administrative overflow, the kind of invisible digital footprint that absolutely nobody thinks about until it completely ruins their life. I opened a new window and drafted an incredibly careful, highly strategic email to the guest relations manager at the Ashcraft House. I did not mention an affair. I didn't mention a divorce or lawyers or custody battles. I kept my tone strictly dry and professional. I wrote that I was updating the museum's vendor records and believed my work email might still be incorrectly attached to a reused booking profile from a past charity event. I formally requested that they check their system and forward me any recent billing notices, receipts, or administrative corrections that might have misrouted to my inbox by mistake. I took a deep breath, checked my spelling, and hit send. Then the agonizing waiting began. I paced the concrete floor of the archive room until my heels ached. I drank 3 cups of terrible, lukewarm break room coffee. Every single time my phone buzzed in my pocket, my heart leaped into my throat. By the time the clock struck 6 and I had to lock up the museum and drive back to my cold warehouse, I was convinced it was a dead end. I was exhausted, depleted, and ready to just accept that Julian had outsmarted me and won. The next morning, I was sitting at my tiny kitchen table, staring blankly at the brick wall outside my window, eating cold toast, when my laptop chimed. Sender: Ashcraft House Guest Relations. Subject: Correction of secondary notification contact / attached billing records. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, echoing in my ears. I opened the email. The guest relations manager was incredibly polite. They apologized profusely for the automated system error. They confirmed that, yes, my direct email address had indeed remained attached to Mr. Julian's executive reservation profile as a secondary administrative contact. Attached to the bottom of the email were 3 separate PDF documents. They were the automated billing summaries generated by the system before the hotel caught the error and removed my email. I clicked on the first PDF, my breath catching in my throat. There it was, black text on a white screen. Julian's full legal name, Elena Vance's name, 2 adjoining luxury suites, itemized room service charges for expensive champagne and strawberries at 2 o'clock in the morning, valet parking logs showing his specific sports car. The dates on the invoices matched perfectly with the weekends Julian had explicitly told Sarah he was attending mandatory corporate leadership seminars in another state. But that wasn't the detail that made the blood run completely cold in my veins. I scrolled down past the itemized receipts to the raw user profile notes. Julian hadn't just lazily reused an old profile by accident. According to the system log, he had manually logged in and updated the primary contact email to a fake burner account. But he had intentionally, deliberately left my museum email listed under the alternative contact / event coordinator field. He didn't do it by mistake. He deliberately left my name attached to the file so that if Sarah ever called the hotel to investigate a strange credit card charge, the hotel staff would casually mention that the booking was associated with Joshua's museum event. He had planted my name at the scene of his crime months ago. I wasn't just a convenient excuse he made up on the fly while crying on the front porch. I was his premeditated insurance policy. He had set me up to take the fall from the very beginning. I didn't call him to scream. I didn't text him. I grabbed my car keys, drove straight to his upscale neighborhood, and marched up to his heavy mahogany front door. Julian answered the door wearing a crisp, expensive polo shirt, holding a mug of artisanal coffee, looking every bit the relaxed, successful executive enjoying a weekend morning. When his eyes landed on me, his face instantly hardened into stone. I told you never to come to this house, he hissed, stepping quickly out onto the porch and pulling the door shut tightly behind him so the neighbors wouldn't hear. I know all about the Ashcraft house, Julian, I said, my voice eerily calm. Julian completely froze. A brief, undeniable flicker of genuine, naked panic crossed his eyes, but he quickly masked it with his trademark arrogance. I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Look, Josh, if you need cash for rent. I don't want your dirty money, I interrupted, stepping into his personal space. I want to know why you deliberately left my work email on your hotel profile with Elena. You planned to frame me for your affair from the very beginning. Julian looked up and down the quiet suburban street, making sure no one was walking their dog. He let out a harsh, patronizing breath, dropping the victim act entirely. Grow up, Joshua. I have a massive career to protect, a reputation. Sarah was getting suspicious and digging into our finances. I needed a distraction, and you're a nobody. You work in a damp basement looking at old maps. You have absolutely nothing to lose. You were convenient. He said it with zero remorse. His eyes were completely dead. Because you were convenient. I didn't yell. I didn't punch him in the jaw, even though my knuckles were white and my muscles were coiled tight. I just looked at him, feeling a profound, chilling emptiness where my brother used to be. You're right, I said quietly. I have nothing to lose. But you do. I turned on my heel and walked back to my car. Julian called out my name, his voice tinged with sudden uncertainty, but I ignored him. I drove straight back to my warehouse, opened my laptop, and drafted a new email. I addressed the recipient line to my mother, my father, Julian, and Sarah. I attached the email from the hotel manager. I attached the billing PDFs showing the adjoining suites and the late-night room service charges. I attached the profile notes showing my name used as a deliberate decoy. In the body of the email, I wrote exactly this. I was thrown out of my family because I was accused of destroying a marriage. Attached is the undeniable administrative proof from the Ashcraft House Hotel. Julian has been having an affair with Elena Vance for months. He intentionally used my name to cover his tracks. I will not continue carrying blame that was manufactured to protect someone else's betrayal. I clicked send. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please help me like the video and leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you've been with me this far. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The fallout from that email was instantaneous and absolute. Exactly 7 minutes after I clicked send, my phone started vibrating violently against the table. It was Julian calling. I stared at the screen and silenced it. Then my mother called. Then my father. Text messages started pouring in, a relentless barrage of panic. These were the exact messages I told you about at the beginning of this story. They were terrified, not because they suddenly realized they had caused me immense emotional pain, but because the golden child's flawless illusion had just been shattered into a million pieces, and the undeniable proof was in writing. Paperwork, hotel logs, and timestamps cannot be manipulated by fake tears on a front porch. At noon the very next day, a young volunteer at the museum came down to the basement archives and nervously told me that a highly agitated woman was demanding to see me in the main lobby. I walked upstairs to find my mother standing near a massive display of old ship anchors, wringing her hands anxiously around the leather strap of her expensive designer purse. "Joshua, please," she said, her voice shaking and pitching up as I approached her. "Don't do this to us. You need to come home." "You already did something to me," I said, keeping a wide physical distance between us. "You threw me out in the freezing rain without asking a single question." She immediately started crying. It was the same dramatic, perfectly timed, weaponized tears Julian used. We were confused. We were acting on raw emotion. "But you don't understand what you've done, Joshua. If Sarah takes this evidence to her divorce lawyer, she will utterly destroy him. She's going to demand full custody of the assets. Julian's inheritance is tied to his public image. The family charity fund will pull his board seat immediately. He could lose his executive salary, his stock options. He could lose absolutely everything. There it was. The ugly, naked truth. She wasn't standing in my lobby because she missed her youngest son. She wasn't there to heal a broken family. She was standing there because she was terrified of the impending financial ruin and the crushing social scandal. He should have thought about his massive salary and his precious inheritance before he decided to use my life as a human shield. I told her, my voice devoid of any warmth. She reached out, her manicured fingers trying to grab my arm. Please, just come back to the house tonight. We can sit down with our lawyers and fix this as a family. A house is not a home when it throws out the innocent son to protect the guilty one, I said. I turned around and walked back down the stairs to my basement, leaving her standing entirely alone among the relics of sunken ships. That evening, I received a harsh text message from my father. It was a strict demand, not a polite request. We are waiting for you in the living room. Come over right now. I decided to go. Not to apologize, not to fix anything, and certainly not to protect Julian's wealth. I went because I needed to see exactly what truth looked like inside that house when the lies finally stopped working. When I walked through the heavy front door, the silence in the house was suffocating. Julian was sitting on the edge of the expensive leather sofa, looking pale, disheveled, and furiously angry. My mother sat next to him, clutching a box of tissues on her lap like a life preserver. My father was standing tall by the stone fireplace, trying desperately to project his usual, intimidating patriarchal authority. You've made your point, Joshua, my dad said, his voice tight and clipped. Now, we need to handle this quietly, internally. I stood firmly in the center of the room, refusing to sit down. I didn't make a point. I just forwarded a hotel receipt. Julian jumped up from the sofa, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. You sent that to Sarah. You knew exactly what she would do. She took it straight to her lawyer to fight for everything. You ruined my life. You handed her everything the second you booked that hotel room with your mistress, Julian. I shot back, my voice echoing in the large room. My father stepped forward, holding up a hand. Enough, both of you. Joshua, what do you want? Name your price. An apology? You want your old bedroom back? A car? What do you want to make this go away? I looked at the three of them. I looked at the exact spot by the front door where my laptop bag had been violently thrown into the storm. I realized in that moment that they didn't want my forgiveness. They didn't care about my pain. They simply wanted to buy my silence. They wanted to contain the massive PR disaster I had unleashed. I wanted a family that trusted me, I said, my voice incredibly steady, devoid of any anger. But I don't want that anymore. I'm done performing for you. I'm done being the convenient scapegoat whenever the golden boy makes a mess. Don't you dare walk away from me when I am speaking to you, my father barked as I turned my back on him and walked toward the door. I stopped, my hand resting on the cool brass doorknob. You threw me away when it mattered, I said, looking over my shoulder one last time. You don't get to command me now. I walked out of that house for the second and final time. The rain from last week was gone. The night air was clear and sharp, and as I started my car and drove back to my warehouse, I felt a massive, suffocating weight lift off my chest. I didn't have an inheritance, and I didn't have a wealthy family anymore. But as I pulled into my parking spot, I realized I had something infinitely more valuable. I had my truth, and I was finally free. A month passed since the night I walked out of my parents' living room and left them to drown in the mess they helped create. I wish I could tell you that everything resolved instantly, but the truth is, the fallout from a shattered family illusion does not settle quickly. It acts more like a slow, devastating earthquake. The tremors of that single email I sent kept rippling through the wealthy, tight-knit social circles of Savannah, pulling down every fake pillar my brother had spent years building. Julian's life unraveled with a speed that was almost frightening to witness. Sarah did exactly what my mother feared she would do. She took the hotel receipts, the timeline of his fake corporate retreats, and the documented proof of his premeditated attempt to frame me, and she marched straight into the office of the most ruthless divorce lawyer in the city. The divorce proceedings were not quiet, and they certainly were not amicable. Sarah filed for full custody of their shared assets, their real estate portfolio, and the massive investment accounts they had built during their marriage. Because Julian had actively used company time, corporate travel accounts, and even a company vendor profile to facilitate his affair with Elena, the logistics firm had no choice but to launch an internal investigation. They suspended Julian without pay. Suddenly, the golden child with the six-figure salary and the untouchable reputation was sitting in his empty suburban mansion, fighting a brutal legal battle with no income flowing in. The family charity board, terrified of the impending public relations nightmare, held an emergency executive vote and quietly asked Julian to step down from his chairman position. He lost his seat. He lost his corporate leverage. And Elena? The moment the firm launched their investigation and the endless stream of expensive hotel weekends dried up, she completely vanished. She stopped returning his calls and blocked his number. Julian was left entirely alone in the wreckage of his own arrogance. But I didn't stay up late rejoicing in his misery. I was too busy trying to piece my own reality back together. The gossip inevitably bled out of their social circle and began creeping toward my workplace. Savannah is a small town when you run in certain tax brackets, and several of the wealthy donors who funded my maritime museum also sat on the charity boards that Julian used to control. I started noticing the side glances from the museum volunteers. I heard the abrupt, hushed whispers whenever I walked into the staff break room. I spent an entire week bracing myself for the inevitable. I was convinced that the board of directors would view me as a public liability and quietly let me go to avoid any association with the scandal. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Gray called me into his office. Mr. Gray was the executive director of the museum, a towering, stern man in his late 60s who had dedicated his entire life to preserving naval history. He commanded immense respect in the city. I walked into his sprawling, oak-paneled office, my stomach tied in a tight knot. I took a seat across his massive mahogany desk, fully expecting him to slide a severance package toward me. Instead, Mr. Gray took off his reading glasses, folded his hands on his desk, and looked at me with a gaze so piercing it felt like he was reading my DNA. "Joshua," he began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. "I attend a lot of country club dinners. I sit through a lot of incredibly boring charity galas. And over the past 2 weeks, I have heard your family's name mentioned more times than I care to count." I swallowed hard, gripping the armrests of my leather chair. "Mr. Gray, I assure you, whatever you are hearing about me." He raised a single, calloused hand, cutting me off instantly. "I didn't call you in here to interrogate you, son. I called you in here to tell you something very important. I know exactly the kind of people who run in your brother's circles. They survive on optics and reputation. When a man like your brother falls from grace, those people will always look for a convenient place to shift the blame to protect their own delicate sensibilities. I hear the whispers trying to paint you as the instigator. I hear the rumors trying to suggest you somehow orchestrated this entire mess out of jealousy." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "Let me be absolutely clear. I do not care about country club gossip. I care about character. I have watched you work in the archives for 3 years. I have watched you handle priceless historical artifacts with meticulous care, honesty, and absolute integrity. You are a man of substance, Joshua. Your brother is a man of loud, empty noise. If anyone, any board member, any donor, or any member of your family tries to drag this museum or your professional role into their toxic drama, I will personally shut it down. You have a permanent place in this institution. Do you understand me?" I sat there, completely stunned. My throat swelled with a thick, heavy emotion I couldn't immediately identify. It took me a moment to realize what it was. It was the profound, shocking feeling of being protected. My entire life, I had begged for my own parents to defend me, to stand up for my character, and they had thrown me into the rain at the first sign of trouble. Now, a man who shared zero blood with me was drawing a line in the sand to guard my livelihood. "Thank you, Mr. Gray," I managed to say, my voice slightly hoarse. "You have no idea what that means to me." "Get back to work, Joshua," he said, offering a small, rare smile. "Those 18th century naval maps aren't going to archive themselves." 2 days after that meeting, a legal courier arrived at the museum reception desk holding a thick manila envelope with my name typed on the front. I took it down to my basement office and opened it carefully. Inside was a formal, notarized legal document printed on heavy, watermarked paper. It was from Sarah's divorce lawyer. It was a signed affidavit, legally confirming in plain, undeniable language that Joshua had absolutely zero involvement in the deterioration of Julian and Sarah's marriage. It explicitly stated that I never encouraged any inappropriate relationships, that I had zero prior knowledge of the affair, and that I was falsely and maliciously blamed by Julian to cover his own financial and moral misconduct. Sarah didn't have to send that to me. It didn't help her legal case to provide me with a copy. She went out of her way to pay her lawyer to draft that document simply because she knew I needed it. I sat at my desk, holding that piece of paper in my hands for a very long time. I read the legal jargon over and over again. After weeks of defending my own sanity, after screaming into the void of my parents' deliberate ignorance, here was my reality, validated in permanent black ink. It was the ultimate, undisputed proof of my innocence. I bought a cheap wooden frame on my way home that night and hung the document on the exposed brick wall of my warehouse apartment. It wasn't a diploma, and it wasn't an award, but it was the proudest thing I had ever displayed. Spring arrived in Savannah, pushing away the bitter cold rains and replacing them with a thick, humid warmth. As the weather shifted, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside my rented warehouse began to shift right along with it. The space no longer felt like a drafty, depressing exile. It was slowly, steadily transforming into a sanctuary. One Saturday morning, Carter kicked open my metal door carrying 2 heavy plastic buckets of premium interior paint, a handful of rollers, and a large Bluetooth speaker. "Get up, man," Carter shouted over the loud rock music he immediately blasted from the speaker. "We are fixing this depressing dungeon today. You cannot live surrounded by gray concrete forever. It's bad for your psychological health." I laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time in what felt like a decade. We spent the entire weekend transforming the warehouse. We pushed my cheap furniture into the center of the room and covered everything with plastic tarps. Carter had chosen a deep, vibrant ocean blue color for the main accent wall. We rolled the paint on thick, our shoulders aching, our hands covered in blue splatters. We drank cheap beer, ate greasy takeout burgers sitting on the floor, and talked about everything except my family. As I watched the dull, gray concrete disappear beneath the bright, fresh coat of blue paint, I realized something incredibly profound about the concept of home. A home is not defined by square footage, expensive chandeliers, or manicured front lawns. My parents lived in a $3 million estate, but the air inside those walls was toxic, heavy with unspoken resentment and mandatory performances. This warehouse was tiny. The plumbing occasionally rattled, and the floorboards creaked loudly when the wind blew hard off the river. But the air in here was clean. It was honest. When I locked the deadbolt at night, I knew exactly who I was, and I knew that nobody could tear me down while I slept. Over the next few weeks, Carter kept showing up with small, incredibly practical gifts. He brought over a heavy-duty toolbox filled with high-quality wrenches and screwdrivers. He bought a set of thick, decent dish towels because he was tired of watching me dry plates with paper towels. He even found a massive, vintage standing lamp at a flea market that actually illuminated the dark corners of the room properly. Every single one of those practical, unglamorous items meant infinitely more to me than the grand, dramatic gestures my family was desperately trying to orchestrate from afar. My parents realized very quickly that my silence was not a negotiation tactic. It was a permanent boundary, and because people who are obsessed with control cannot handle being ignored, their attempts to reel me back in became increasingly frantic and bizarre. My mother started writing long, multi-page letters on her expensive monogram stationery and mailing them to the museum. I would recognize her elegant, sweeping handwriting on the envelope, and I would drop them directly into the industrial shredder by the copy machine without even breaking the seal. I didn't need to read them. I knew exactly what they contained. They contained long, winding paragraphs about family duty, about how much pain she was currently in, and about how Jesus teaches forgiveness. They never contained accountability. They never contained the sentence, "I am deeply sorry for throwing you out into the street." My father's approach was entirely transactional, which fit his personality perfectly. He left a long, rambling voicemail on my phone one evening. He didn't sound angry anymore. He sounded like a businessman trying to close a difficult merger. "Joshua, listen." His voice echoed through my phone speaker as I stood in my blue-painted kitchen. "I spoke to Henderson down at the corporate logistics firm. He owes me a massive favor. There is a senior project manager position opening up next month. It comes with a substantial salary bump and full benefits. It's a real promotion, Josh, way better than playing with dusty maps in a basement. I can secure it for you tomorrow. We also have some funds left over in an old college fund account we never fully drained. I can wire that over to help you put a down payment on a real condo. Just come over to the house on Sunday for dinner. Let's act like reasonable adults and put this ugly chapter behind us." I stood there holding the phone, listening to the heavy silence after the beep. A year ago, the promise of a massive promotion and a sudden influx of cash would have made me jump through hoops. A year ago, I would have desperately craved that validation from my father. But listening to it now, I felt absolutely nothing. No temptation, no anger, just a profound, quiet pity. He honestly believed he could buy my self-respect. He believed that transferring money from an old college fund and handing me a corporate job could magically erase the memory of him screaming in my face and throwing my only picture of my grandfather into the mud. He viewed my dignity as a commodity with a price tag. I pressed the delete button on the voicemail. Then, I opened my phone settings and permanently blocked both of their numbers. I blocked Julian's number. I blocked their emails. I built a massive, impenetrable digital wall around my life. I didn't do it to punish them. I did it because I was finally building a beautiful, peaceful life in my blue room, and I refused to let them track their muddy boots across my clean floors ever again. Time has a funny way of accelerating once you stop waiting for other people to validate your existence. A full year passed since the night the golden child pointed his finger at me and blew my life apart. It was a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 year later. It was raining outside, a steady, rhythmic downpour that washed the streets of Savannah clean. I was sitting on my comfortable second-hand sofa in the warehouse. The vintage lamp Carter bought me was casting a warm, golden glow across the room. I had a cup of hot coffee resting on the table, and I was reading a thick biography of a naval explorer. The room smelled like fresh rain and roasted coffee beans. I was completely, deeply at peace. I had recently accepted a promotion at the museum to head the entire archives department. Mr. Gray had kept his word, elevating my career based entirely on my merit and hard work. My salary had increased enough that I could finally afford to fix the crooked kitchen drawer and buy a real mattress. I was healthy. I was sleeping 8 hours a night. I had built a solid, unwavering circle of friends who loved me for who I was, not for what I could do to protect their image. I reached over to pick up my coffee mug when my phone screen suddenly lit up on the table. It was a text message. I had blocked my parents' numbers months ago, but the notification showed an unknown number. I opened the message. It only took one sentence to know exactly who was sitting on the other end of the line. "Today is a very hard day for my heart. I still pray every single night that you will come back to us." It was my mother. She had likely bought a cheap burner phone or used a friend's device just to bypass the block I had put in place. I stared at the glowing white letters on the screen for a very long time. I listened to the rain hitting the tin roof above my head. I thought about the terrified, soaking wet 27-year-old man who walked away from his childhood home a year ago, convinced he was a worthless failure. I felt a sudden, powerful urge to reach back through time and give that young man a hug. He had survived the fire, and he had built something beautiful from the ashes. I didn't feel a spike of rage when reading my mother's message. I didn't feel the desperate, clawing need to explain myself to her anymore. I looked at those words, and I saw right through the manipulation. She wasn't praying for my happiness. She was praying for her own comfort. She wanted her punching bag back so the family portrait would look complete again. I typed out my reply slowly, making sure every single letter was deliberate. I came back to myself. That has to be enough. I hit send. Then, I immediately blocked that new number, turned my phone on silent, and placed it face down on the table. I picked up my coffee, opened my book, and went back to reading. The transaction was complete. The past was permanently archived. The real ending to the story isn't just that one hotel email changed everything. It's how it changed everything. That boring, administrative hotel correction didn't just expose an affair. It exposed the entire rotting foundation of my family system. It exposed how quickly the people who claimed to love me unconditionally chose their own convenience and social standing over the truth. It exposed how absolutely terrified they became the moment cold, hard paperwork replaced their dramatic, emotional performances. People talk about revenge all the time. Society tells us that revenge has to look like a massive explosion. It has to look like screaming matches in the street, slashed tires, or dragging someone through the mud publicly until they break. We are taught that to win, you have to destroy the other person. But my revenge didn't look like fire. It looked like a clean email subject line. It looked like an attached PDF document. It looked like the absolute, uncompromising end of my cooperation. My revenge was refusing to accept the role of the villain in a play I never auditioned for. My revenge was refusing to come back home just because the people who broke me had finally become afraid of the consequences. The greatest revenge you can ever achieve against toxic people is simply living a spectacular, joyful life that they have absolutely zero access to. Julian lost his wife, his massive salary, and his prestigious board seat because his own hubris blinded him to his own digital footprint. He believed his performance was so flawless that reality could not touch him. My parents lost their youngest son because they valued their reputation more than my humanity. I lost a toxic family, but I gained an impenetrable sense of self-respect. When I look in the mirror now, my spine is straight. Shame bends the spine far more than grief ever could, and I refuse to carry their shame for another second. This brings me to a question that still stays with me, something I want you to really think about tonight. When people only apologize to you after undeniable proof corners them and threatens their livelihood, is that actually love? Or is that just fear wearing a softer, more familiar face? Before we wrap up, let's talk about the real takeaway here. Because I didn't just share this painful chapter of my life to vent. I shared it because I know, right now, someone listening to my voice is standing in the rain, taking the blame for something they didn't do. The biggest lesson I learned is the incredible power of critical thinking and documentation over blind emotion. In life, manipulative people will always use high drama and emotional outbursts to create chaos, blinding you to the facts. They rely on your shock to sneak their lies past your logic. But truth does not need to scream to be real. Truth lives in the quiet details, the timelines, the receipts, the history. My life was saved the moment I stopped reacting emotionally to my family's betrayal and started thinking logically about their motives. Always protect your integrity. Set ironclad boundaries, and never, ever let anyone convince you that you must sacrifice your dignity just to keep the peace in a toxic room. If you found value in this story, and if you agree that self-respect is worth walking away for, please leave a comment with the word good below, or share the specific lesson that resonated with you the most. Your interaction tells me that these stories matter. Keep your head up, stay grounded in the truth, and never let anyone write your story for you. Thank you for listening.